Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Fringe Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today we are joined once again this week by Mr. Hermann Pretorius. Hermann, thank you for coming back on.
It is a pleasure to be here.
And also by Mr. Alex Weiss, who's joining us from Germany, where he has a bit of an outsider's perspective. Alex, thanks for stepping in today. Really appreciate it.
No, of course. Always a pleasure to share this platform with you, gentlemen.
Thank you very much, sir. Right. So we should probably talk about the thing that everyone is talking about, but that probably no one really wants to be talking about. That is, of course, load shedding. We're in stage 6 as of this recording. I don't know how many of you are even out there to listen to us because your phones are dead or your internet connection is not working. But regardless, Eskom has given us that charming little notice where it says we're on stage 6 until further notice. And so it's worth considering at such a time of national crisis, a crisis which I must say is provoking some of the largest amounts of grumpiness I've seen, even from the fairly sympathetic to the ANC media. There's a sort of dawning realization that the government doesn't really seem to have too much of a plan to fix this amongst the commentarios. But not to fear, our foreign minister, or rather our international relations and cooperation minister, Naledi Pandor, has some theories about this. She says that, you can think about load shedding as an attack on South Africa, and that it is, quote, an oppositional act against SouthAfrica.com. I'm not quite sure what she's implying here, but it really sounds to me like she's suggesting that there are malevolent dark forces, possibly foreign, working to undermine South Africa. Now, this, of course, follows in the footsteps of Energy Minister Gwede Mantashe saying last year that it looked an awful lot to him as though Eskom was in cahoots with some malevolent dark forces to overthrow the government of South Africa. Herman, what do you make of this?
Well, I mean, firstly, I'm slightly losing the will to live, but on another level, it is bizarre that something that is in complete state control basically, is in cahoots against the government. That's special. That's a really, really special. But the sad thing is, and before the show kicked off, we had this sort of a bit of a banter about the CIA being involved, and this is a tried and tested trope of the ANC. When they can't blame whites, they move on to Indians. When they can't blame Indians, they move on to the West. There's sort of a hierarchy of blame shifting that in some bizarre corner of the ANC's mind still has some purchase on their thinking. We've said it on the show before, but part of the arms deal nonsense was that I know of a cabinet Parliament member of Parliament who asked the ANC, why are you so worried about, why do we have to spend billions and billions on military equipment and stuff? And then an ANC MP in full, sincerity said, haven't you seen what Blair and Bush are doing in Iraq and possibly Zimbabwe? They might invade. So the idea that the West or that foreign forces are conspiring against South Africa, I mean that's an excuse as old as the ANC. But I must say it is quite cute that everyone with two brain cells to rub together can look at the ANC and understand what's gone wrong. And then Lady Pandor, who, let's be honest, is actually one of the more intellectually able members of cabinet, can spout nonsense like this. I mean, it's pathetic. It really is on the level of banning open-toe shoes and cooked chicken. This is the liberation movement just losing steam, losing credibility, and I think losing faith in its own arguments.
Right. So, Alex, there's been this kind of move, I think, by the sharper tools of the ANC's shed to say something along the lines of, well, you see this. There's still these malevolent forces at work here. Now, they never really spell out who they are. It's always kind of implied. But it's either, I don't know, the Zoomerites, the RET faction, the state capture crowd, the CIA, something. It's always something like that. But if these forces have been working against us for so long, you have expected it's not really a great excuse, because it's also your job to deal with said problems. I mean, when your CEO has an assassination attempt against you, that's kind of also on you. You kind of sort of need to do something about it, rather than go, wow, that's bad, and then just sort of shrug your shoulders and go back to how things were. What do you make of this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the capacity to take on platitudes as the South African public, I think, reached its zenith many years ago. And I saw a tweet the other day, can't remember from who, it's sort of mentioning that, we've had load shedding for the majority of the ANC's reign. So, I think to how the powers that be cook up these sort of excuses, and as Hermann says, we are, as you say, are gaslighting us, although gaslight is all we seem to have at the moment, we don't really have much to go on anymore. But I think it's also when Ramaphosa comes out and says, we have a plan, or Pandor says, the CIA are malevolent forces undermining our electricity grid. It's just there's not even an attempt to take in the people of South Africa into their confidence. There's no pretending. It's beyond pathetic at this stage. And I think everyone's just kind of biding their time until people who actually are somewhat serious about the country's issues step into these roles. And if I was a public official, the attempted poisoning assassination of a head of a state-owned entity would freak me out, like in a very selfish way. But clearly, that's not a concern for the people in charge.
I think something 100%. That we should also take into account, that this is also the party that about 4 months ago, a bit longer, mid last year, a serious idea entertained by the president. Did your South African flag just collapse?
That's ominous.
Yes, and a bunch of lamps. Apologies.
Oh, well, I mean, if that isn't a metaphor, I don't know what is. But this is also the party and the government that have, in July about last year, seriously considered the establishment of Eskom 2.0 as some sort of a solution to the Eskom problem. It's entertaining to see that Ramaphosa has been, quote unquote, in charge of Eskom since 2014. As leader of a turnaround strategy. What actually has come out of that? What are any actual government decisions that have been presented to the public, presented to Parliament, presented to whomever as something of a solution? The best we have is sort of, or the most tangible changes that we've had in Eskom is now the government taking over fully. I mean, that how badly could that end? And the question of perhaps let's open the market by creating another state-owned entity. It really is bizarre that they have they've even run out of good excuses, that they are now at the point of, and someone in the comments mentioned it, South Africa isn't important enough for anyone to sabotage us. There might have been some point where there was some symbolic use in what's going on in South Africa. But I think, again, I get back to the quote of James Myburgh, who essentially described that the ANC has done more damage to Eskom in government than when the ANC's official policy was to sabotage it as part of the armed struggle. That sort of places things in context. And the energy crisis isn't something that is difficult to solve. It really isn't, because it doesn't need to be solved holistically. You can have incremental improvements, and those incremental improvements...
Right, you can go from permanent stage 6 to maybe stage 2 permanently. That would be a vast improvement.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I must say, it's just ridiculous that no policy, and even the excuses, the good ones, have been used up. And now we're to a point where, SouthAfrica.com somehow enters into this. But it's telling that you didn't say SouthAfrica.org, because that would imply some level of organization.
So just for those, I'm sure everyone who listens to the show regularly knows what we suggest should be done to fix Eskom. But some of the things, scrap BEE, hire whoever you can to fix the problem. Disentangle Eskom, break it up into pieces with a view to possibly privatizing it at some point. deregulate in a large way and allow lots of independent power producers to come on to the grid. You also have
Nick,
to fix the police.
I just quickly want to add something that 2 years ago, when I was still at IRR campaigns, I was on ENCA or SAFM, I can't remember, one of those mainstream thingies, talking about a petition we had sent, and Eskom had criticized us and we had criticized Eskom. It was a whole thing, and I was on air, and the journalist was like, "Okay, so Mr. Pretorius, what are you and the IRR suggesting?" And I said exactly this, what you just said, and she said, "Yes. We know that's not going to happen. Beyond that, what do you think should be done?" And
Look. We can't do any of the things that'll fix the problem. What else can we do?
Yes, and that's sort of the we're up excrement creek without a paddle. That's where we've gotten ourselves somehow. And to think about an alternative policy direction. Oh no, not that, not privatization, that dirty word, not getting rid of BEE. Come on, no, things that other things.
You know what would actually be a good start is firing people who don't do their jobs properly. That would also probably help a bit. But anyway, let us move on to our next story for today. And this is a little one that caught my eye. I don't think it's particularly too much of a surprise. I wouldn't call this is a bit of a water is wet type of story, but still worth thinking about. The MEC of Environment and Infrastructure Services for the city of Joburg, Michael Sun, who is, I think, a DA councillor, has called on residents to play an active role in guarding infrastructure. And then he went on at length to describe to the media how the city was suffering from serious vandalism for different reasons. On one hand, the city is losing, it's having lots of power outages due to people stealing electricity cables, cable theft. He also said that last year, more than 200 JoJo tanks, which were provided to areas that were facing water disruptions, or areas that don't have taps yet because they're like new shack settlements or something like that. 200 JoJo tanks were either stolen or vandalized, which meant that the services were not delivered. Of course, he went on to say, "The situation breaks my heart. Cable theft and infrastructure vandalism is killing service delivery across the country. We need communities to work with us this year to ensure we put an immediate stop to this plague." And this is not just a Joburg problem. Every single municipality in the country, whether it's governed by the ANC, the DA, whoever, suffers from this problem. Cape Town suffers from this problem. Durban suffers from this problem. Joburg suffers from this problem. The small rural municipalities, if they had any services, would suffer from this problem. Alex, what's your take on this? I mean, I must say it does irk me a little bit when you see a politician in saying, the communities must work with us. Does he have a point?
It's such a tough situation because on the one hand, because we're so unused to service delivery or getting anything tangible as taxpayers, when things are provided, and they are vandalized, it's like, well, you kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't, because when you provide it, it's going to get stolen or it's going to get cut or the like. So I sympathize with as a councillor like this, appealing to the people to assist them in protecting public infrastructure. And I don't know, part of me feels like it's almost just a broader symptom of probably a large part of the population just feeling completely disenfranchised, not feeling part of the society, so not valuing the infrastructure that is provided. And I think that is such a systemic and deep-rooted problem that it can't, putting out a WhatsApp number to contact your councillor to try and solve this is sort of like putting not even a Band-Aid, sort of just the little sticky part of the Band-Aid over a massive crack. So I sympathize with them. I can't really see it as sort of scapegoating their own failings. But yeah, I mean, to wake up to look one day there's a JoJo tank and the next there's not. I mean, that's pretty brazen stuff as well. So it's a tall order, and we know the state of our policing as well. So not an easy job, but something's got to give.
And the policing aspect is one that if we have time we might return to in the show. But Herman, I think Alex has it exactly right there. There's there's a sort of dysfunctional relationship. If you've ever seen like a toxic relationship between two people, it's often not just a one-way thing. It's often both parties have this way of undermining or hurting each other, and there's just a lack of trust generally. And that really, I think, describes the relationship between South Africa's government and its people. The government doesn't trust the people, and the people don't trust the government, but they still demand things from each other, right? The government demands taxes, it demands obedience, demands all sorts of compliance with its silly rules, and the people demand services. But the moment the one actually fulfills their end of the bargain, the other one abuses it.
I think something that Alex mentioned there is spot on. He used the word systemic, and I do think that we are looking at a bit of a systems failure, and this is several systems failing. We've got the social contract, whether it actually exists or not, we live as if it does, with this idea that we give government certain things and they owe us certain things. So there's the social contract system has massive failures there. That bleeds into the democracy aspect that we have in the previous election, the lowest, or in the previous national election. We have diminishing returns on our democratic dividend of people actually showing up to vote. But then we've also got families and communities suffering as a sort of systemic components. And then we've got probably the two components that are interrelated is the economic component and the educational component. And then we have, just basic law and order. All of these things, what happens when all of these things slowly start collapsing is what we are seeing now, with the fact that even if you try to build, it's one step forward and 3 steps back. And then the question really becomes what can be done about this, because it's a very, very depressing picture. And perhaps people might accuse me of ideological orientation or whatever, but the fact is that most of these issues can be solved by socioeconomic improvement. Cable theft, I mean, it's clear from the data. Cable theft, vandalism, civil protest, these things correlate very closely to successful economic policy or unsuccessful economic policy. So if the government has one thing it controls, it can't just pull a lever and restore trust in the social contract. It can't just pull a lever and restore trust in democracy. It can't do that for communities and families. But what it can do is it can do 3 things immediately, essentially immediately. It can take the necessary measures to improve law and order. It can ensure that there's accountability within the police system, get rid of cadre deployment. Similar aspect on education, remove the power of the trade unions, give it back to the parents. But then the biggest one, the biggest underlying responsibility that the state ultimately can have is to create an environment where the rational decision maker within a society can see that it's a riskier bet to do cable theft than to get a job. Because currently in South Africa, the job market is more risky than cable theft or just petty vandalism. Or, it's just the government have rigged the system to such an extent that people genuinely think a life of petty crime is the more attractive option, rather than building, the basic foundations of a property owning democracy. So I do think that everything isn't in the state's control. And I hate blaming apartheid, but there are elements of this that really goes back to generational failures of the fabric of society. But if I were government today, or were I to advise government, I would say you can't control everything, but you can make policing better and explain to South Africans how you're going to do that. You can make the education system better and explain to South Africans how you're going to do that. And you can make the economic environment better and explain how you're going to do that. And in time, it won't happen quickly, but in time, that will bleed into solutions in terms of trust and community fabric restoring.
So, Alex, a final point on this, I think there's a temptation amongst, a lot of South Africans, particularly very cynical South Africans, to say, but, of course the government's not going to do any of this because they're infested with criminal networks and bad ideology and whatever. But I think the real reason we should be talking about these things and talking about the solutions and talking about the problems is because we are on the hinge of a kind of political change. And we want that political change to go in a positive direction. We need to be already right there with the correct solutions and the good ideas and the proper alternatives, so that we don't get, sort of populist, vacuous, race hustling morons like the EFF filling the void and sending us to hell in a handbasket. Do you agree with my point there? And do you have any final thoughts on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think otherwise if we don't have hope, or in the form of solutions at least, then one's kind of doomed. Then you get into this kind of nihilistic spiral of despair and discontent, and it's not productive. So I think
Exactly.
I think like Nick, we were chatting before the show about how, having come back from leave, getting back into the swing of things, it's been a bit difficult, I think, because there is kind of the sense that things aren't, especially in the nature of the work that we do, there's not really a lot of light at the end of the tunnel. And so I think if we don't sort of cling on to these solutions, which we know work, and there are examples in other countries to show how things can be better. If we look at, I was trying to think before the show, where in the world are things maybe looking better, or can we look at? And I think the one that popped to mind was Zambia, so some sort of relatable sort of context. So things can change. People know they can. So if we don't sort of cling on to the hope that things will change, and I think a lot of people are kind of, as I said, sort of biding their time until 2024, till the elections. And that presents a whole nother issue of actually getting, again, how do you, with this undermined social fabric, getting people to the polls to actually, bring about
exactly. If you just despair, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, as you say, that nihilistic spiral.
Exactly.
And
anyway,
I'm so glad that Alex mentioned Zambia, because that's really a good example. Everything isn't going right in Zambia, but a few key things are going right. Inflation between June and October last year.
I think their currency was one of the strongest performing in the world last year in terms of relative improvement.
Between October, I think it was June 2021 and October 2022, while the rest of the world saw increasing inflation, Zambian inflation actually came down. And probably the biggest breakthrough that the Zambian government under the presidency of Hichilema have accomplished is a deal with the IMF, which can inject fiscal stability into the government to ensure service delivery, but crucially also have some safety rails that comes with the benefit of an IMF deal, some credibility for investment. So, even if South Africa got a new government tomorrow, and the only thing that happened in the first year of its governance was to negotiate a successful IMF package, that would be a massive step forward. It would mean so much in terms of investment, job creation, fiscal stability, credibility, and just plain good old trust in what could be accomplished in the country. So people shouldn't despair. These things can change. It's not easy, but they can.
If Zambia, which is, I think, literally everyone on earth would agree, is in a more difficult position than South Africa, at least in the sort of physical terms, that if they can start coming right, then anyone can.
Yeah.
Maybe not North Korea, but that's a discussion for another day. Okay. So let's just talk about, I think it's the first day of school today for state-run schools. Not having children and not going to school myself, I'm not 100% sure, but that seems to be what the news is saying. Anyway, so there were 3 interesting stories that all popped up related to this from different provinces. So in Gauteng, Angie Motshekga, the education MEC, was very upset at, the Minister for Basic Education, was very upset that people had blamed the online registration for new school kids for the reason why 1,000 kids at Gauteng have not yet been placed in school. She said, no, it's just all normal problems and it's got nothing to do with the new system. But it remains that 1,000 kids still haven't been placed yet. In Northwest Province, near Zeerust, there was a riot, a service delivery protest, as we might call it, where apparently people were upset about water shortages in the area, and the protesters decided to attack the school, chase away the teachers, and force the kids to go home. They disrupted the schooling on purpose. It does look like the thing was quelled after midday or so, but or already by kind of 10, 11 o'clock. But the schooling was still disrupted. Oh, there goes my power. And the last story was the education MEC for Limpopo saying that regardless of overcrowding, she will make sure that every single student in Limpopo is placed in a school. And this was her duty as a political officer, to champion the right and safety of all learners. So, Hermann, just your thoughts about the beginning of the school year. What's interesting about these stories is perhaps that they're not actually that interesting, in the sense that this happens every year. And I think it does say something about the state of our education system.
Yeah, but a while ago, Alex made a video for the IRR, which put into visuals the throughput rate of 1.2 million grade ones start off, and 12 years later, 55,000 of that class end matric with more than 50% mark in mathematics. Essentially, the basic building block for some sort of successful professional career after that. And for the soundtrack, I sent Alex a video that he used the sound of, which was a bunch of grade 1 kids singing Nkosi Sikelel. And it was quite harrowing, actually, looking at that final product. And I saw it the other day again, because here you have these young kids on their first day of school singing Nkosi Sikelel. You hear the excitement, the hope, the sort of looking forward to a new adventure. Groot school, as we call it in Afrikaans, it's one of those, it's like, oh, now you're no longer going to play with crayons, you're going to eat them, but you're going to learn how calculators work and stuff like that. And there was just this underlying sadness to know that these kids are being failed, and being failed unnecessarily so by a centralized government. Because if I can put it this way, the people who sort of have kids, I don't think this morning the government had told anyone to give them breakfast, and yet the parents who could provide breakfast probably provided breakfast in 90% of cases, and yet the government had nothing to do with that. And I can't understand why schooling should be different from breakfast. Both are important to development. Both are sort of part of equipping your kid for future life, whether it's nutritionally or educationally. And I just think it's bizarre that kids aren't placed. It is sort of like the government saying, oh, apologies, this morning we didn't deliver a few thousand packages of Oats So Easy, so kids won't eat this morning. Why on God's good earth is that the responsibility of the government in the first place?
Alex, I think actually the last thing you may have written for the Daily Friend .co.za was actually on education. But your thoughts on this? I mean, of course, Herman's talking about school vouchers, right? Mm-hmm. The ability of parents to decide where their kids go to school, placing essentially the choice of where the government spends its money on education in the hands of parents, which will allow poor parents more options when it comes to school.
Mm. Yeah, I think it's a good follow-on from what was our previous sort of note of not losing hope and that there are solutions out there. I mean, in the one story that you cited, I think the one from Limpopo, the school governing body stepped in last year to build a shack to house excess children so that they had a roof over their heads to learn. But then now they're concerned that the shack will collapse on the kids. So it really is quite desperate. But there's an example of a solution in play to the extent that the community can perform some sort of support. The active role of school governing bodies, parents getting involved in their children's education, stepping in where the government's failing. And I think that's the kind of thing that, as desperate as that seems, it is the kind of thing that we need to hold on to hope for. So, I think until such a stage as we have some sort of regime change or or some sort of government that can implement things like school vouchers, like giving more power to parents, reducing the influence of the unions, the South African Democratic Teachers Union, for example, nothing will really change. And I think until then, we're going to get every year at the start of a year, the starter pack of issues, some racist incident at some law school, protests outside this school in the Northwest, something. And no real change to outcomes. And I think that's the problem. Same with load shedding. There's no plan for how to produce better outcomes and actually improve things on the grounds. But there are ways, just got to, and I think, it'll be interesting. It'll be very interesting in the next 16, 18 months to see how receptive people are to solutions after such a prolonged period of real sort of bashing and sort of dashing of hope.
Might I quickly chuck something in there, Nick, or are we pressed for time?
If you keep it very short.
Okay. A few months ago, I was involved in negotiating a scholarship program, trying to see, if there are private schools that we could approach to essentially take well-performing kids, irrespective of their race, but in financial difficulty, and give them the resources so that they can finish their schooling. It was depressing how many of the people we spoke to said, "Oh, you want this thing to be non-racial?" And we're like, yes, the non-negotiable, race won't enter into it. And some of the bigger private schools, I won't name names, but people might be curious about which schools they are, but I won't indicate. But some of these people actually said, "Oh no, you want a non-racial scholarship program? No, it has to be, no, it can't benefit. It has to benefit a specific racial group or that or that." And I just thought, my goodness, BEE thinking and race-based thinking is placing such a bloody full stop and ceiling on the development of kids who have nothing whatsoever to do with the past of this country and everything to do with the future. And yet here we are, and the people who are currently in the system can't think beyond the limits of their own prejudices.
So if I have one request, besides liking and subscribing to our followers, is that talk about the school voucher idea to anyone in education, because it's a really great idea, and more people should look into it, get behind it, because it's only with a lot of civil society support, I think, that we're really going to see politicians move on this one. Anyway, with that, thank you very much for listening. We hope you had an interesting time, a thoughtful time, and we will see you next week on the Daily Friend Show. Cheers, everyone.